All right, so I'm Frank Wright, but AKA Mick. You can call me Mick. I'm the Director of SUD Services for the Veterans Healthcare System of the Ozarks, and we serve parts of 3 states, and our central office is in Fayetteville. And we have a pretty, well, the most comprehensive continuum of care that I've seen since probably the 80s. I started in the field in '73. We had an intern last year, Miss McKenzie. Great hair, Miss McKenzie. She's a real sweethearted. But I was talking to her one time. She said, "You know, all the things you talk about your experience." I was thinking, man, is he like 100 years old? And I thought, well, maybe I look 100 years old, but no, it's only 40, however many years, 73 till now. So across the continuum of care for children, adolescents, adults, and geriatrics, inpatient, outpatient, partial hospital, intensive outpatient, and residential. I don't know what else there is, but maybe there's probably a whole lot. So the really cool thing about the VA, and part of why I'm there, I was a clinician all those years. I never stopped doing clinical, and then became clinical supervisor and senior executive. I've been in the for-profit, not-for-profit, public and private sector, sort of feeling all of in your excellent training, your multi-system life course training, you recognize macro systems have a direct impact eventually on the front line and what you do. So I've had the benefit of serving in sort of the different economic constructs of social services. And my disclaimer is, yes, I have a severe bias against for-profit psychiatry. And I'm very interested in doing the right thing and not doing it only because you can bill for it, if that's even possible. And that's why I ended up kind of gravitating to the VA, because I was tired of doing more for less. And really the cardinal rule is if you can't bill for it, you can't do it. If you can't generate a billable, then we can't justify you doing it. And then there's this performance-based reimbursement that's had to evolve because of managed care over several decades now. And so a lot of agencies your salary is directly impacted by how much you work. So if you're willing to work 60 hours a week, you might be able to make a decent salary if you can get those billables up, right? And then some folks gravitate to private practice because they're tired of sharing that. Doggone it, if I've got to share it, I might as well do it myself. So there's a lot of private practice used to generally, back in the 80s, it was people were making $100,000 a year. Now these days, man, I was in private practice, and it was for every 45-minute therapy session, there was at least a half hour of admin calls, billing, collections, appealing my billing, why it wasn't paid, et cetera. And I'm not really good at that. So anyhow, so that's why I'm at the VA. So Ananda asked me to talk about our program services, and I'll do that. And I brought a few handouts give you an idea about the opioid epidemic. And opioid replacement or opioid agonist therapy is probably something that you might be interested in. How many have heard about Suboxone or buprenorphine or naloxone? Have you heard of those? So those are, that's an interesting evolution of treatment, because I know that probably all of you have heard of methadone, right? That's been around since, I think, the 60s, maybe earlier. And methadone maintenance. And without getting bogged down in the weeds, there's sort of this landmark study that a lot of clinicians refer to in the VA relative to opioid replacement therapy, where in that study, and I'm sorry for, is there a research professor here? I don't know the validity. I don't know the style of study. I don't know if they did double-blind controlled. I just know that they refer to this study a lot. And it said that 90% of those with opioid use disorder don't respond to traditional treatment, and they continue relapse. Mm-hmm. And so, as justification for think outside the box. Your traditional models aren't working. And so my theory is, you guys have gotten some good brain science exposure, I'm sure, right? So, long-term use of multiple substances does severe literal damage to your prefrontal cortex, your ability to judge and make good decisions and control impulses, right? And the craving from the center part of your brain just gets increasingly out of control. It just gets hard to deal with. The craving becomes overwhelming. And so the craving sort of overwhelms your executive function. And so even if you get tons of education, even if you get tons of support, there's just a real high risk. And so then there's some of these programs. The most interesting to me is treatment court programs. You're aware of that as an evidence-based practice, right? So we have a veteran treatment court, and we serve about 25 counties in 3 states. So we have, if you've done any criminal justice stuff, you'll know that every court is kind of unique. The personality of the judge, the prosecutor, the public defender, and they all kind of have a different approach. But the cool thing is that when you look at the cost of incarceration and the effect on recidivism, the legal term for getting arrested again, and you look at the cost of treatment court and the effect on recidivism, it's a no-brainer. A fraction of the cost, better outcomes. So that's, but then you, again, in your multi-systems life course, then you've got to think about macro systems. The prison is like a third of the state budget, and they're kind of like a lobby, and they're really interested in promoting get heads in the beds. And if you go to for-profit prisons, they get paid by the number of inmates, and so then you got the impact of ethics on how long they stay and all that stuff, right? The outcomes are really good. It's a good sell, but we have to fight sort of this perpetuation of public perception. I just want to be safe. I don't care about outcomes. Just get them off the streets, lock them up. And so that's pretty hard. This morning, Judge Christy Beaumont, Washington County Judge, you know her? Isn't she awesome? I love her. I sat right next to her this morning. You know where we do veteran treatment court staffing? At our clinic. She comes out with the prosecutor, the public defender, the probation officer, the court clerk, case manager, and our treatment representation from our PTSD treatment program, our general mental health treatment program. We've got homeless services, et cetera, et cetera. And twice this morning, I noticed we have this paragraph summary of each person. We have, I think, 22 people right now in Washington County that are veterans in her court that we serve. I was looking at acceptance commitment therapy, prolonged exposure therapy, cognitive processing therapy, case management with MICM, PRC, which is a rehab day treatment program. We were looking at transportation and medications, and we had the computer up, and we could look at the nationwide check if they're filling prescriptions elsewhere, and we could see what meds they're on and when the last time they had lab. I mean, that's very state of the art. And I worked 34 years outside the VA, and I just, unless things have, I got a feeling because of reimbursement, they haven't gotten much better since I left in 2008. But this is the best I've seen since we had indemnity insurance. Indemnity insurance was sort of the open book for treatment of mental health. In the late 70s, early 80s, it sort of became an explosive cottage industry for mental health and substance abuse. And it got exploited. Freestanding for-profits, average lengths of stay would be maybe a year with high cost. And then and it was amazing when their major medical of $1 million policy ran out that they were ready for discharge. And so actually insurance companies, some insurance companies went belly up. And so it's kind of on our own fault. The for-profit healthcare system sort of set that up. And so then the pendulum swung the opposite direction. It was crazy. I remember to this day an 18-year-old young lady in my office with her parents who was acutely suicidal. And literally, if she wasn't being physically restrained and watched constantly, she'd go to the first available source to hurt herself, including banging her head against the wall. And we called for pre-authorization for their managed care intermediary, and they said she hadn't failed an outpatient yet. They couldn't hospitalize her. So the parents had already been up for like 2 days trying to physically restrain and constantly monitor, and that wasn't good enough to justify an admission. Acutely suicidal. That's changed probably primarily because of litigation. So continuum of care is we have outpatient, intensive outpatient, residential programs. 90% of our veterans with substance use disorder have comorbidity, mental illness, diagnosis. Real high incidence of PTSD, as you would imagine, right? Our most recent set of vets would be often referred to as OIF, OEF, and OND. That's Iraq, Afghanistan. And the difference today is when I was serving in the Army, I said I started in '73, it was as a psychology social work specialist in the military, in the Army. I was academy trained, and I dealt with a lot of Vietnam vets coming back from Vietnam. Serious drug issues back then. 87% of our veterans in Europe, when I was head of a community drug and alcohol assistance center there, 87% used hashish recreationally. 87%. By self-admission, with disregard to the potential consequences they did on this report the colonel saw. They didn't care. So, I mean, that's a serious drug problem. So, and then we had legal quaaludes over the counter, et cetera. So let's see where I got lost there going off into my military days. I get lost there a lot. Anyhow, I cut my teeth on the military, on the veterans, and a lot of our guys got PTSD, and veterans during Vietnam had PTSD, but the difference was they might get deployed once to Vietnam, 13-month tour, and come home, be a mess. Once in a while, if they were a warmonger, and that did happen, they did really enjoy the anarchy of combat situations, and they'd want to go back. Those are a particularly unique breed of soldier. But that was more the exception than the rule these days. The multi-deployments, you've got families, you've got jobs that are disrupted over and over and over again. What a strain on soldiers and families. It's pretty severe. But real similar dynamics. Perhaps you may have thought, I don't know if you've thought about this, but war or warlike situations. Have you heard the term moral injury? Have you heard of moral injury? I mean, you get trained to be good at killing, and so you become really good at your job, and then you come out and you come back to the normalcy of life, and you think, what kind of animal am I? I actually enjoyed doing that, you know, and so the adjustment in the moral injury is quite a challenge. And we have that same dynamic today, and in urban settings where one of the instruments of war may be women and children, ununiformed and unidentifiable, and not knowing who your enemy is. You talk about anxiety in a combat situation, holy crap. And then people, I remember a Vietnam veteran talking to me about being on the perimeter and looking through his infrared scope and seeing a figure trying to breach the wire with a bomb on his back, and taking him out. Then there was some gunfire, and then after it settled down, he went out there and he saw it was about a kid, he couldn't be more than about 9 years old. So he lived with that. And so that's the kind of stuff that goes on in war. So those are the things that we deal with our vets. It's an honor to serve veterans. The vast majority of our guys, it is a great honor to serve. There is that element of maybe 2%, might be higher than that, see the VA and Uncle Sam as a source of a free ride, and they try to exploit and embellish some of their symptoms so they can get more money. But it's really a small minority, and we fight that just like you would. We have a higher incidence with substance abuse of Axis 2. You know, we used to call it Axis 2, not in DSM-5. So we got personality disorders, high incidence of antisocial and histrionic and borderline and narcissistic. So that makes treatment a little more difficult. So we use a lot of DBT. That's really good. And sometimes we have to use DBT before they can get into something as intense as prolonged exposure. Do you know what prolonged exposure is? It's like painfully reliving the traumatic episode and learning how to cope and restructure cognitively and breathe and relax, et cetera, and working through it painfully. And so that you got to have some coping skills to go there. So I'm over time. Oh, not over time? Oh, I got 5 minutes left. Oh. So what's really cool is we've got a PTSD team, and we got a general mental health team, and we've got psychologists and social workers, and I can say this, that's another disclaimer, I have another bias. I think social work is the best training. I mean, I've had to be this executive lead for multidisciplinary treatment teams for, I don't know, spanning 5 decades. And man, you just get the most bang for your buck. as somebody who's answering to a chief financial officer, and we have to, how much we can bill for, and all of the diversity of and capability, the eclecticism that's part of your training, the socio-ecological model with your also an appreciation of in your model, developmental influence, which is excellent. Versus somebody who's, I only do a 50-minute session and I do this kind of therapy and that's all I do. And don't talk to me about contacting the family and if they've got transportation to and from their clinic session and if they've got access to their meds or if they can pay their heating bills, right? MICM folks, if they can, if it's so cold in the winter and their heat isn't working, that's not what I do, And that's hard to work for somebody who cares about the wraparound picture, where you really want to give them what they need to be a success. That gets increasingly hard to deal with. So in secret, I would often let those positions die by attrition, and you know what I replaced them with? Social workers. So I really appreciate it. And for decades, you guys were the best reimbursed master's level clinical care. And LPCs have gotten up there. They've gotten a lot better. In our state, there's also LPE reimbursement, but still social workers generally nationwide, my experience, I can't tell you this statistically or with research, but my experience says social workers are still the best you can get for billing and collections and a diverse application of clinical practice. So they can adapt. You guys are like chameleons. You get great basic training and you can bring those skills up wherever you're put. So am I biased? Yeah. So whatever that is. We'll get to questions later. I'm going through my mind wondering what would the graduate social work program really want to know about common day. Oh, here's an issue. There's research that shows that spontaneous recovery does happen and that controlled use can occur. And we do that too. The problem is that the vast majority of people that I get in my program have tried that and failed repeatedly. And I don't know if you've heard of Dr. Jelinek, but he was kind of the first one to identify the alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon types of alcoholism, different types. And the out-of-control alcoholic or addict is because most of our admissions to our programs, outpatient services, intensive services, and residential programs, their entry gate is the acute care. So after an overdose or after a suicide attempt or after they get kicked out of their house or their wife says you can't come home. And that's great leverage for therapy, by the way. And when I hear that there's still perhaps a salvageable primary family system who's really fed up and kicking butt and starting to say you can't do this anymore, boy, we engage them right away. We got really good outcomes with that. And being able to salvage that is great. Sad to see, having just been at the VA now for 10 years, I've worked with them when they had intact families and been in treatment the second time, been in treatment the third time, and I see, and the divorce finally happens and their job's gone and now they can't see their kids and they're back in treatment. The chronic recurrent relapse issue is quite challenging. And then you guys are familiar with SAMHSA, I'm sure you're familiar, right? So they've been doing research probably the longest with regard to both substance abuse and co-occurring disorders. And one of the primary contributors to chronic recurrent relapse is, and the research would support this, is unidentified and untreated comorbidity. So that's the one thing that I love about the VA. I mean, we look for it and we treat it. And the old school would have been, you got to be sober first. We can't treat the mental illness. But the research now shows that concurrent therapy has best outcomes. So you get them started. So we do that in spades, and it's really a joy. And our clinicians, in evidence-based practices, I'm going to close on making a challenge to any of you that have yet to do a research project or maybe going on to a doctor level where you have to identify a dissertation and defend it. Here's my fantasy, all right? So in the 70s, I'm so old I went to workshops with Albert Ellis. I mean, I heard him curse while he was lecturing about great cognitive restructuring. I mean, he's a great guy. But there were over in 1970-something, when I was doing a little bit of research, there were over 300 identified evidence-based practices, or we called them research-based or empirically based back then. And now I don't know, but I think there's at least hundreds of recognized EBTs. So how many of you are, and so many of them now are manualized, right? So 12-step facilitated, for example, is one of the recognized evidence-based practices for substance abuse, okay? But it's a program, and everything else has to fall aside to maintain the fidelity to this manualized course of treatment. So like, what if they've got comorbidity? What if they can't come in as regular? Contingency management, you have to do it 2 times a week, 20-minute sessions with urine drug screens, get them reward good behavior mod at supplemental, it's got good outcomes. But who in the clinic has time for 2 times a week plus urine drug screens in addition to everything else? It's just, research-informed practice, practice-informed research. If clinicians would develop. So here's my challenge to y'all, you brilliant people who want to do a research project someday. All of those evidence-based practices, manualized therapies, not one of us in this room will ever achieve all of them in our career lifetime. We won't be able to do it. We can't do it. So we need practice research that takes that culls out the cause-effect variables in the therapies, in multiple therapies that affect multiple primary diagnoses. And we need to develop evidence basis for principle-based therapy so that you can, as a good social worker, because this is the kind of therapy, it falls right into your kind of ballpark of theory. If you can get the research-based training, like for this evidence or this principle-based therapy that takes into consideration prolonged exposure and cognitive processing, and cognitive behavioral, and all this stuff that's vogue, and kind of melds it into one kind of model, you can be good for, I'm sure you will find comparable outcomes. My experience tells me that's my hypothesis. I just would love to see research happen to that degree. Okay.
All right, I'm Kim Williams. It's really hard to go behind Mick. I don't have nearly the experience that he does, but I'll give you my experience from a college counseling standpoint. So my background is also in social work, and I went through the same program that y'all are going through. I have an additional certification, AADC, which is the Advanced Alcohol and Drug Certification, and so I currently work at CAPS, which is the Counseling and Psychological Services Center here at the U of A, and so I work primarily with college students, only with college students right now. And so my area of focus at CAPS is alcohol and other drugs. So I see students with all presenting concerns, but kind of my area of interest and my area of focus within my position is AOD. And so I currently serve on the substance use disorder treatment team at the U of A, and so I meet weekly. Actually, in about 15 minutes, we'll be having a meeting with somebody from the medical clinic. So I work with one of the nurse practitioners pretty closely. And then a position over in wellness and health promotions is dedicated to alcohol and other drugs. And so we are working on trying to create more programming here on the U of A for students who are in recovery, for students who are interested in recovery or just interested in participating in activities that don't involve alcohol. Obviously on a college campus, a lot of events involve alcohol, a lot of the parties, certainly this time of year with football and tailgating, there's lots of alcohol and opportunities to drink. And so I have students in my office that want other alternatives. And so one of the things that we are working on now is sober tailgating. And so we had an event last Saturday for the Vanderbilt game, and then we'll have another tailgate for the LSU game. And so we have food and games, and we have a TV set up where we can watch the game and do everything that you do at a tailgate minus the alcohol. That can be a really triggering event for people walking around trying to tailgate, wanting to, hang out with their peers and do some fun social activities. But that being around that alcohol can be triggering. And so we are working with a group of students and trying to figure out some other activities on campus for students to be able to participate in. Also have a group, so Monday nights 4:30 to 5:30, I facilitate a group over in the wellness building, which is over by the Garland Garage. For students who are interested in addressing substance use concerns. So that's a little bit about what I do on a day-to-day basis here at CAPS. Like I said, I work with students that, just like Mick was saying, with comorbid diagnoses. I mean, most of the time students aren't going to come into my office and say, I have issues with substances. I'm feeling really anxious, I'm feeling depressed, I'm really stressed about my academics. And then the more we talk about it, I realize a lot of times they're coping with those stressors through the use of substances. We don't see mandated clients at CAPS, and so I'm not going to, anybody that's like in trouble with judicial or been mandated by the court to receive treatment, we don't see those students or serve those students at CAPS. They would get a referral out to the community. So everyone who's in my office generally maybe doesn't want to be there, but they're coming in there on their own accord as opposed to being mandated. And so with that being said, I do tend to work with, in terms of substances, lower levels of severity, and so low to moderate levels. If it's anything that requires like an IOP or intensive treatment, I'm going to refer out. A lot of times that involves sending a student home. They need to withdraw from the semester, and so I'll work with case management at CAPS, and we'll try to figure out a treatment facility in their hometown closer to where they're from. If it's something that can be managed through IOP, then we'll try to work with agencies closer to us. We are a shorter term model at CAPS, and so that means we're not going to see a student from their freshman year until they graduate. And so somebody needing longer term services, we're going to refer to private practice or to community-based clinicians. Trying to think in terms of kind of how I approach treatment with college students, it probably looks very different than what it looks like at the VA, because a lot of times the students I work with aren't interested in abstinence only. They're not necessarily even in recovery yet. And so what I do, I work a lot with harm reduction strategies, figuring out ways for students to be able to drink in moderation, to drink and stay safe. And so we talk a lot about, just things that may seem like common sense that students don't always think about, making sure that you eat, making sure you're well hydrated, ride sharing, staying with a friend, not taking drinks from other people. You never know what's in that cup. Figuring out ways to help them manage if they don't want to drink, but they still want to be in those environments. And so, walking around with a red Solo cup, but you have water in it instead of alcohol, those kind of things. So that's a lot of what I do. I do a lot of psychoeducation about serving sizes. And so a lot of times when I ask my students, my clients that I'm working with, how many drinks do you have in a night? And they say 2 to 3. Well, if you really look and, we start measuring how much alcohol, it's probably closer to 6 or 7 drinks, and they just don't realize that. And so I did bring a handout for y'all, if y'all are interested, and we can pass that out at the end. But it just gives an example of serving sizes. Part of what we do at CAPS, we have several trainees in here now, but we have a training program, and so we all take turns giving didactic presentations. And so during my presentation, one of the things that I do is bring in a pitcher of water in a measuring cup, and I have the students pour a drink, what they would consider, if you're going to a party, what would you pour? And then we pour it back into that measuring cup, and we see how much alcohol is really right. Yeah. I'll just have a drink, and then it's 18 ounces of and just educating on the difference in beer. That's pretty controlled. I mean, if you have 2 cans of beer and that's 12 ounces, 12 times 2 is 24, as opposed to just the punches get really dangerous because people don't know what's in them, or the difference in drinking, a beer versus Everclear. So a lot of psychoeducation. Yeah, slight difference, shots versus controlling, separating, spacing out your drinks with water. A lot of just education on alcohol use. A lot of students come in and feel like everybody on campus drinks. I have to drink. Everybody drinks. I'm involved in Greek life. I have to, consume alcohol to be able to go to this party, to be able to loosen up. What we see is there's a lot of, unfortunately, I'll have students come in that have been sexually assaulted while they were under the influence of alcohol. And then there's a lot of guilt and shame and blame involved with that. Well, I shouldn't have been drinking. Oh, it's my fault. I can't really recall. I don't remember consenting, but I don't remember saying no. And so then we end up working through trauma as well. Students that are coping with academic stressors by taking Adderall to stay up all night to study and feeling like they need those substances, those stimulants to be able to be academically successful. And so those are kind of the things that I most often see in my office in terms of substances, marijuana use. More stimulant use in terms of cocaine than what I expected when I got to campus. So again, just working on readiness of change, I use a lot of motivational interviewing, helping students kind of identify where they are. I educate on the dangers of mixing substances with medication. So I'll have a lot of students that come in that are prescribed an antidepressant or prescribed a benzo for anxiety. And there's some significant dangers, especially in mixing the benzos with the alcohol. And so we talk about that, and so and I try to educate and try to get them, hopefully to use safer or not to use certain combinations. And then I do have some students that have come back to school who are in longer-term recovery, and so that treatment's going to look different than the harm reduction strategies. That treatment's going to be, how can you maintain the sobriety? How can you maintain, being in school and the stressors, those urges, the cravings that Mick talked about, the triggers that you'll see around campus. Non-traditional students maybe that have family stressors, financial stressors, have a history of failing out of school before and trying to come back in and balance all of those. So we definitely see the gamut, but I would say by far the most work I do in terms of substances is with harm reduction strategies, keeping students safe and trying to get them past the point where they're not going to need higher levels of care like Mick provides down the road. More often than not, statistics do indicate that students mature out of drinking. Doesn't always happen, but a lot of times, 19, 20-year-olds, they get to college, they have a semester or two of, heavy drinking, partying, and then they kind of phase out of that, buckle down, and go on with their lives, and it's not problematic. But there's certainly, I'm being told I have 5 minutes, so certainly those students that do need more intensive services. I work with the medical clinic, like I mentioned, and so one nurse in particular she's on the treatment team, so she's very familiar. She will do lower level detox and very light, moderate detox for students. They can definitely help provide baseline labs. I'll send students downstairs that I'm working with ongoing, and I say downstairs because we're up on the second floor and the medical clinic is downstairs. I'll send them downstairs for lab work just to make sure, that their liver is okay and all the different levels. We don't offer a full medical detox program at the U of A. If a student needs that, then I'm going to refer out again. I think if there's anything else? Holidays are coming up. That's a hard one for students, having to go home, triggers at home, family issues. A lot of holiday parties involve alcohol and drinking, and so helping students come up with either a plan to manage their alcohol consumption, and I also provided a handout on that, or figuring out ways to say no, to avoid alcohol, figuring out ways. I use a lot of CBT in what I do, helping to manage those thoughts, those cravings, those triggers, to be able to navigate the holidays a little bit easier. So I think that's all I have for now. If anybody has any questions at the end, I'll do my best to try and answer them.
I recognize a couple of you from having you in a class as undergrads. Cool to see you moving on along. I am a LCSW, and I also went through this program a few years back. During that time that I met Ananda, had an internship and worked as a school social worker at that time. So I've also worked at CAPS, Youth Bridge, working to do individual, family, and group counseling with teenagers who, a lot of whom had been referred through the juvenile justice system. And I worked at Vantage Point inpatient hospital with adolescent children and some adult populations. And then from there, I made a transition to private practice where I'm at now, seeing mostly adults, kind of taking a break from the teenagers. I like them, but needed a break. I'm seeing a couple right now, but I'll probably expand that. But I'm really enjoying getting to know the ins and outs of working with adults, and certainly one of the big issues that comes my way is substance use disorders, or at least people wanting to examine their relationship with substances, mostly alcohol, other substances as well. I really appreciated hearing from both of y'all. So jotting down notes as you were each talking, so I may repeat it a little bit. But also, kind of like piggyback on something that you touched on, Kim, which was about how often people don't come in to specifically work on a substance issue, and then it kind of comes out later. So what I'll try to do, if I can do it in 15 minutes, is kind of take you through 3 different phases that I work through with clients, starting with assessment and then supporting their decision of either abstinence and sobriety or moderation management. And then a third phase, which we have the luxury of being able to do in a private practice setting, because we can see clients for a longer period of time, years sometimes, and that's digging underneath the problematic behaviors and getting to the underlying issues. So with assessment, I typically don't spend a lot of time asking really specific questions about their substance use. I might throw it out there, how much are you a drinker? How much do you drink, on a regular basis? But I don't stay there. I kind of, no matter what their answer is, I kind of move, to the next question. A little bit later, I might ask, oh yeah, so are there any other substances that you use? So I kind of like to not cluster those things together so that a person doesn't feel like, especially since this is our first time to meet usually, a person doesn't feel like they are being interrogated. And some people have just an awful lot of shame about substance, their substance problems. So then I just listen for clues that there might be an issue. I will zero in sometimes on a what seems like a mood disorder, and ask lots of different questions and just say, okay, so one thing we want to do here is kind of figure out what the roots of this disorder are. We want to find out if it's a biochemical, neurochemical issue, so that we might want to consider medication. We want to figure out what systems are working and which ones are not working in your life, what kind of current stressors you have, whether or not you have some past trauma that is just kind of coming up. That can be a real mysterious thing that we don't always recognize, and it can be a real trigger to substance use. Of course, Mick was really hitting on that being prevalent in the VA population. And then, and then I'll kind of sneak around the back door and say, something that is just real sneaky that a lot of people don't realize is that even not like real heavy alcohol use can really contribute to depression, anxiety types of disorders and other types of mood issues. And that'll usually kind of get a person, thinking. I don't really ask anything specific, but just listen to what they say back. So usually then, next session, if some things have come up, and I'll tell you the majority of the time, there's something, related to some substance that is worth addressing anyway. I will just propose, that we might spend a little bit of time just exploring the person's relationship with that substance. So with alcohol, one of the few things that I'm a big fan of in the DSM-5 is the section on substance use disorders, and especially the criteria. So there's for most of the different disorders, alcohol, opioids, stimulants, each one has about 11 different criteria, and you actually just have to meet 2 of those criteria for them to have been prevalent over 12 months for a person to qualify for a substance use disorder. So some of them are, Do they have cravings for the substance? Are they unable to stick to a limit that they had intended to, either in terms of amount or duration of using? And then get to a couple of interesting ones. Continued use despite persistent or recurrent social or interpersonal problems. And then a separate one is important social, occupational recreation activities are given up or reduced. And I say those two are interesting because, at a glance, a person might say, no, I've never been drunk and decided not to go to work because I was drunk. But a lot of people have been hungover and decided not to go to work because they were hungover. A lot of people have started to maybe not even realize it, reduce their socializing and stay home, in front of the baseball game instead of getting together with some friends for the baseball game because they have found some comfort in being able to just drink and be alone and not have to mess with people. So getting conversations going like that, kind of piggybacking right off of that first session with the assessment, a lot of times, folks will kind of come up with on their own the idea that one of the things they want to work on in therapy, they didn't realize it is, reducing their substance use, or in some cases, without me even prodding, actually, going for abstinence, especially if a person's been struggling with depression for a long time, gone through some different medications, different treatments. I'm not their first therapist, and they're still struggling. Those depressive episodes keep coming on. If they realize that there's a possibility that stopping drinking might actually end these depressive episodes, they're really on board to try. A lot of people aren't wanting to do that, and I kind of stay there with the exploration for long enough to let a person have some time to change their mind. I don't prod or push them to change their mind, but I just provide some different types of psychoeducation, kind of piggybacking off of their own ideas about how a substance might be contributing to their other issues. I use some motivational interviewing techniques also. One that I really like, if you never pick up a book about motivational interviewing, one of the core pieces of it you can just learn right now. It's just to ask a person, what are the pros and cons of using that substance? That really disarms a lot of people. I mentioned earlier, people having a lot of shame about substance use. Along with that, inevitably comes, for most people, a pretty high level of defensiveness. So, as I'm going through all this, of course, I'm juggling, and trying to get a read on what our rapport is like, how much they're trusting me, how much they think I'm some jerk who thinks he knows it all, and wait till we get past that to do anything that even resembles confronting. But the motivational interviewing piece, if I start to sense a little bit of defensiveness, I'll just switch right over and say, well, you're not drinking for no reason. And that's something I hadn't asked you about yet. Like, what are some of the things you're getting out of drinking? I know there are some positives. And, people will usually say, well, it gets me out, it gets me socializing, and that's about it. It's kind of interesting. Sometimes people have one or two others. But it's interesting because doing that, a lot of times, somebody who was resistant to talking about negatives will then on their own switch back over to the negatives and kind of just, what I'm trying to give you a sense of is that, I'm providing some education, asking questions in a certain kind of way, being pretty gentle about it, but also staying there for a while, staying on the subject for a little while, even if there's not at first a whole lot of evidence that there is a substance problem. Just because of my experience, it is really, really common that there is one, and I'd rather that come out at the very beginning than 6 months into, some heavy psychodynamic work on, how the family of origin contributed to the current depressive episodes. So then phase 2, supporting their sobriety or their moderation or their harm reduction. Those are kind of 3 different possibilities if they're going to do something about it. In some cases, we just kind of talk about harm reduction because a person may be drinking a case of beer a day, 24 beers. You're not going to go from that to none. You shouldn't go from that to none. That's dangerous, actually, because of withdrawal symptoms. So we talk about harm reduction. So, for a person who's doing a case a day, if we can get down to a 6-pack a day, that's significant. And then, of course, we can, set other goals. But, of course, I let the clients set the goals. I throw out some different options. If a person has had some real negative effects, some negative consequences from their drinking habits that are just obvious. They've gone to jail, they've lost a family, lost a job, anything along those lines. They have liver problems. And at the same time, they have 5 minutes, okay. Will you do that again when it's like 30 seconds? And so if a person also has some history of using another substance, let's say marijuana, that's probably the most common one I would do this with, and they really haven't had a lot of negative side effects to that, I'll throw it out there. Would you be willing to taper down? And if you do that, I give you full permission to smoke as much weed as you need to during this time. A lot of times people will kind of go for that. And again, it kind of takes me out of the position of seeming like an authority figure or lecturing to them. So then, there's one book that I always give to people or recommend that they read. I don't give it to them. I'm not that generous, but I have them look it up and order it. If they're dealing with alcohol and if their goal is abstinence. And so this book, I recommend that you take a look at it. It was just published last year. It's called This Naked Mind, and it's by Annie Grace. And what it is it's a book that she intends to be its own sort of treatment. A person reads this book, and by the end of the book, what she's attempted to do is to undo the societal brainwashing that we have all received throughout our whole lives that alcohol is just fine, not a problem at all, and in fact, we probably need it because we're not going to have any fun without it. So her point is it's one of the real barriers we're up against with alcohol specifically, and I would say with other substances too, depending on your social circle and your peers and your family, is just people freaking out when you stop it. People do not like to hear that you're not going to drink anymore. A lot of people will freak out. One of the big points that she makes is, would that ever happen with any other drug? If you told somebody, I'm really feeling like I need to quit heroin, would people like, oh man, no, not even with tobacco. So, but we do that with alcohol because from the time we're born, perhaps, our parents might have celebrated with, or our dads might have celebrated with, kicking back with a beer. And we've seen so many commercials and movies and peers, and just, it's such a part of our culture. And of course, a lot of people have a healthy relationship to alcohol. I'm not saying that can't be done, but a lot of people don't. And a lot of people have trouble recognizing that and having that accepted by others. So then, I'll just touch on real briefly, working on underlying issues. So a couple of guidelines. I like to start that really early because their motivation is high. When they first make their decision to either cut down or do harm reduction or abstain from a substance, motivation is up. So motivation is also going to be up to start digging into some of those underlying issues that may be driving the substance problem. One exception to that is trauma. So I wait at least 3 months, usually about 3 to 6 months before we would do any true trauma work. I look for, so there's some longer term withdrawal side effects that a lot of people experience. A pretty small percentage of people actually experience severe acute alcohol withdrawal. And that's a good thing to tell people because people get pretty scared about that. It is something to pay attention to because it can be life-threatening. And you want to, if somebody's shaking, sweating a lot, having any kind of hallucinations, you want to send them straight to the hospital. If they are, drinking, if they're the case of a day person that I was mentioning earlier and they want to just go down to 0, they need to go to the hospital and detox. So depending on amount, length of time, and then any of those symptoms showed up, that can be pretty dangerous for the first 4 or 5 days. But that's rare. And then after that, side effects really start to get a lot less severe. But for 3 to 6 months, anxiety, insomnia, and some of those autonomic dysfunctions may show up. The sweating, increased heart rate, blood pressure may be off. So I'm just kind of, after about 3 months asking folks about that. If we have identified that there is some past trauma, then at that point, we'll probably kick over and just do some structured trauma work. I use EMDR kind of as my main model for that. And then, okay, and we're at 30 seconds. So last thing I'll say is that can be a motivation in and of itself. So I'll tell people, we're gonna have to have about at least 3 months, between when you go completely clean and we start digging into the trauma work. And I'll give them some education about what that work is. People get a lot less scared about it once they start learning that it involves, well, with EMDR specifically, a lot of positive visualizations and emotional regulation techniques and just, good stuff. But I kind of use that as a little bit of a carrot. Like, we'll get there, just as soon as you're, at least about 3 months into your sobriety. So yeah, I think that's all I have. Thank you.
Does anybody have a question?
Yeah.
So whenever you were speaking to using like methadone or Suboxone and then maybe having that be more effective than just like coming straight off, I'm just interested in like how going back to that same environment plays into the recovery rate. Or do you know what I mean? Like, cause, yeah.
A lot of people that are opioid dependent, opioid use disorder severe, on buprenorphine, we typically use Suboxone because it has the naloxone component with the buprenorphine, which makes it supposedly not abusable, but I think there are still some ways to abuse it. And the DEA regulates it in addition to the FDA because there's a high risk for diversion and making money off of it. And they continue a job in their family. By the time they get to us, more often than not, if they're considering opioid replacement therapy or agonist therapy, whatever you call it, they really want to get clean, or they want to get off of they want to quit having to buy the cost of that opioid dependence is pretty severe. And of course at the VA, they can get the opioid replacement for free. Buprenorphine is not free on the outside and it's quite expensive, but, and I don't know what third-party payers are like now, but when I was first seeing this done, when I was a director of clinical services at the University of Arkansas Medical Sciences Department of Psychiatry, we were doing buprenorphine out of pocket, and there are plenty. I mean, their clinic was full with self-pay customers. So initially, the induction might, of course, there's if you're using the Suboxone, you can put them in withdrawal because of the naloxone. So you got to make sure that they're in withdrawal before you start the first induction or the first dose of buprenorphine or naloxone. But once they're through that euphoric induction, their level of functioning, I think this is a really interesting ethical construct for lots of discussion and learning. Because I have a psychiatrist that I've worked with, for example, won't prescribe it. He thinks it's unethical. You can't substitute one chemical dependency with another. He's morally opposed. And then, of course, a lot of the more harm reduction, research-based, cost-benefit, all of the other analytics might say, well, the lesser evil is ethically justifiable, and if you want to call it that. The other problem is this. I mean, if you don't get them on something, they're at high risk for overdose, and we're talking about life-threatening. So I'd rather see somebody on buprenorphine than put them out there at risk for an overdose and death, not to mention what they're killing in their social life and their neurochemistry. So yeah, they end up at a real high functioning rate compared to even methadone, and can work full-time jobs and do really, really well, and continue in, it's called OBOT, office-based opioid therapy. They just come in for their prescriber. The prescriber has DEA processes he has to consider for diversion, and they got to do urine drug screen. It better be in their system if I'm prescribing it because it might be being diverted. It should be at the right level. There better not be any co-occurring central nervous system depressants because that's really dangerous. If you're on benzodiazepines, for example, it's very dangerous and they shouldn't be prescribing. So I don't know if that answers your question, but Yes, they very often return home since we don't deal with anybody below 18. Home very often is a spouse. There's a very interesting study by Stanton and Todd in the 80s. It's a longitudinal study with adolescent substance abuse that identified one primary characteristic that had to be addressed in therapy for people to achieve recovery. And I find it fascinating because I see it in my practice. I've seen it for decades. And that is that the long-term or chronic dependent, especially the opioid dependent, alcoholic is got a symbiotic or enmeshed relationship with the parent, more often the parent of the opposite sex. And you'll see somebody, a chronic user, a career user, who lives with mom or within a block, still, and they call it pseudo-differentiation or pseudo-individuation. And they can't differentiate from that parent in a healthy way. So the pseudo-differentiation is, well, I'll do something I know that they don't want me to do. It keeps me dependent and allows me this sense of I'm doing something independent. And so the clinical intervention in a family systems model, independence, probably reframe with the parent, I know you really love your son a great deal, but you're killing him. If you really love him, you're going to be tough. And sort of that's in a nutshell. That's kind of, so you try to reframe and engage them to stay involved, but with maybe a little more accountability. I hope that answers your question.
So I have a question from an online MSW student. She asked, what would you say is the hardest part about working with the substance abuse population? And I believe it's for all three of you. So.
I can say for me, it's chronic recurrent relapse. And when you're passionate about your work, I mean, when you've created this wonderful work of art and they go out and they mess it up, it's hard not to get that countertransference going and being pissed off and wanting to be punitive or feeling hopeless or feeling emotionally somehow attacked that you've had a treatment failure. Terence Gorski uses the relapse prevention model. I don't know if you've learned from him. He's in terms of N equals, he's got the most data to support his theory. But if you've, in a relapse prevention model, if you have gone a shorter distance of time using this time, or used a little bit less, or got back into treatment a little sooner, that's something to be celebrated. If you had a period of abstinence that was 1 month, and you hadn't had a period of abstinence for 1 month in 14 years, that's something to be celebrated. So we build on the strengths, good social work model. What works, and how can we reinforce that? And what's gotten in the way in the other part of relapse prevention is what are the triggers?
Same, but I'll say a different one. But yeah, relapse is just, it can be real heartbreaking. People can make so much progress, when they really are off of some of these substances, and then it can just crash, really crash. Just recently had somebody who was doing great and then went to jail just after a real short relapse. But I'll say when somebody comes because somebody else wants them to be there, that's pretty hard. A lot of times I've definitely been lied to by those clients, no matter how hard I'm working to kind of get their trust. Especially it seems like with opiates and with methamphetamine. Yeah, I mean, I think of one particular client who I could just tell that they had recently, done some opiates from the dilation of their pupils, and they would say, "Oh yeah, it's been I'm celebrating 5 weeks now." Okay, I don't know what to do with that yet. Maybe I need more training from somebody like Nick on how to handle those situations. But that's tough. That's tough when they don't want to be there. Sometimes those people will turn and be motivated intrinsically, but really they're not going to make any progress till they are motivated by themselves.
Death is a real bummer. Death by overdose or withdrawal. I mean, if you're anything like me, you get emotionally connected to your clients. So that's tough. And I don't want to be callous, so I'm kind of proud if I can cry. That's something that I think I've earned and learned and grown into. So it's all right for me.
I would just say from my perspective in college mental health, since my clients aren't mandated, a lot of times they just fall off. They just quit coming. We'll work really hard. I'll get really connected, feel like I have a really good rapport, therapeutic alliance with them. We'll really, I'm thinking of one in particular. I worked with her for months and months and months, and she was working really hard. And then she got back with an ex and started using again, and she just quit coming. And I don't know where she is now. I don't know how she's doing. I don't know if she's in school still. So that was really hard to sit with. Just the clients that just out of nowhere just start no-showing you, and you can't contact them. So.
I was hoping you guys had a success story to share versus, I know we often focus on the hard, troubled cases because those are the most interesting and learning experience, but any kind of success stories you guys have?
Thanks for that question. That's really good. That's another way of coping. You really have to be purposeful about celebrating the victories, and I actually am cognizant of that with the treatment team. We have to, and in fact, I tell people that are in recovery from treatment, please come visit the clinic. Talk to the other guys, come say hi to the staff. We need to see it in flesh and blood, but I can tell you an adolescent and an adult story. I could tell you tons of stories. But so I got this guy, I can tell you his first name's Ron. He's a 14-year-old polysubstance abuser from a affluent upper middle class neighborhood outside of Chicago. I was the adolescent treatment program coordinator for an inpatient psych unit. And 95% of our adolescents are brought there against their will, right? Into a locked psych unit. So he's brought in by the police in handcuffs, right? Parents finally, mom's crying, my son's in the hospital, and dad's just like wide-eyed, like, I can't believe this is going on with my son. He owns a construction company. He's a manly man. And so we do the intake orientation separate, the adolescent and the parents, and we help the parents process their feelings. We talk about what the treatment's about, blah, blah, blah. And then if the patient, the adolescent, or in the family systems approach, if the identified patient is seeming calm enough and wants to, we allow them to say goodbye before the parents leave. So as they're approaching the nursing station, Ron lunges at his mom, grabs her by the back of the hair, jerks her head back, spits in her face, and says, I don't ever want to see you again. I hate you. So 4 weeks later, in lots of intensive therapy and behavior mod and lots of gained insight, and of course he's clean in a locked psych unit, he's finally allowed to have family therapy again because we can't let him close to his parents, right? So he comes into family therapy, and I have the privilege of sitting there while he, with tears, authentically apologizes to his parents and talks about his motivation for change. And the mom's just crying, and I'm sitting there thinking, this is such a privilege. Man, I can't believe I get to do this. And so there's this powerful reconciliation, and then the mom turns to me and says, oh, thank you for giving us our son back. So I can't believe I still get emotional. That was like 1985 or something. I don't know what the heck. So here's another interesting story. We got a guy who's a 3-time loser in criminal justice system. That means you've been sent up 3 times, you've been incarcerated, you've been sentenced to prison. All substance related, never in treatment. And from Sebastian County. And Sebastian County Judge Tabor. He's there's a long history of the hanging judge. You remember the infamous hanging judge? It's Sebastian County, Fort Smith. That seems to still be a culture down there. Don't tell anybody I said that. But they're just like punitive, punitive, punitive. Make them pay, make them pay. So this guy, we try to advocate for him to get into veteran treatment court. He's never been in it before. He's never had treatment. And he's facing, with the most recent charges, he's facing 25 to something years penitentiary, some hard time. And so through various avenues, prosecuting attorney, judge to judge, prosecuting attorney, we got him into vet treatment court. And he stays out of prison. And you talk about, and he's done really, really well in therapy. First time in his life. So that's another success story. Okay.
Success story, and then we got to wrap it up. Or actually, either of you have one more. That's a good positive note to end on.
Yeah, quick one. Somebody that came in in his 50s and had been struggling with alcohol use, a lot of drinking since he was a teenager. Had a history of trauma, both physical and sexual abuse as a child. And also had a methamphetamine problem that was causing some psychosis. So our first few I inherited him from another therapist who did some great work with him to kind of get it down to the fact, help him realize that the psychosis was actually related to the meth use, and that the delusions were. He was able to see not all of the delusions, but that some of them were not true. He was able to see that. So I inherited him there. We did some more work on the delusions, and as soon as he just, kind of turned even one more corner and saw, okay, all these things are not happening, and it's because of the meth that I think they're happening. And it was things like thinking there were people on his land that weren't there, thinking they were encroaching and going to attack. He had lots of weapons, and because of the delusions. So once we got through that, and he did some hard work, to be free of both illegal meth and prescription stimulants. Once he got there, he just became really motivated to also come off of alcohol, because he saw what happened when he came off of meth. And so I made the pitch that I was mentioning earlier about trauma work. I said, I think you are really going to be able to benefit from trauma work. Something else I meant to mention earlier that I try to say to everybody. First, I try to figure out, what really is driving this habit. And then I really always try to look a person in the eye and say, I get it. I understand why you drink, so that they're not feeling any judgment, and so that they're feeling like somebody has seen the statement that they've been making for years, and sometimes for their entire lives, because sometimes it is a statement or a cry for help. So I told him, I get it. You went through some really, really difficult stuff, and those and that happened in a way that you were too young to know how to handle it. And so thank goodness, you were able to kind of not be there completely. You were able to dissociate. The aftermath of that now is that some of those emotions you experience from that trauma are sort of still free floating, and they just sneak in on the present sometimes. And I totally get it. That is a really overwhelming situation to just have those types of emotions flooding you. So let's see if we can maybe get to where we can do some trauma work, and let's just kind of go with the hypothesis that is the main factor that's left here on your desire to use substances. And so again, he was very, very motivated, and he read the Annie Grace book that I was mentioning earlier. Would come in like all fired up, like, I can't believe that, like, I just saw this commercial that, like, implied that if you have a Budweiser in your hand, you're going to get like 6 women right away. And just real motivated guy. After about a year of sobriety, of not having a drop, he just said, I can't believe it. He dropped a cuss word in there, and he said, I especially can't believe how I got here. I never thought that I would say I'm not drinking anymore, and the reason is because I got in touch with my emotions. Still coming to therapy too. He wants to. We're kind of at the tail end of the trauma work, but he's just kind of like growing in a positive direction now. He may be a lifer for therapy, somebody who can benefit from it long term. Thank you for asking that. That's like Mick.